welcome back to Boru Art. Today I'd like to take you with me as I create a guy I'm going to call Norman. And I'll tell you a bit about the process that I used for this piece, which is mostly in watercolor. And I'll start out by saying that I'm 100% in the camp that there's not a right and a wrong way to paint. You know, maybe you'll find things that are more helpful for you, and that even might change depending on what you're after. So Norman started out being a tiny little pencil sketch, about 1 inch by 2 inches, and I liked how he looked, so I thought that I would do a watercolor of him. And so I started by sketching him on the paper and then creating a border, which you can see in the blue, with some painter's tape. Now what I found that sometimes tape can be a little bit too sticky, and so sometimes it'll damage the paper when you pull it off, and that really is aggravating after you've done a whole painting and then you damage it by taking off the tape. So here's tip number 1. I usually will stick tape on fabric first, so maybe even my jeans. I'll put the tape on my jeans, lift it off, and then put it onto the paper because it'll pick up some of the fibers from the fabric, and it'll just become just a little bit less sticky. And when pulling it off later, if I have any doubts, I'll actually use a hair dryer to soften it up a bit and then pull it off very slowly at an angle, and that usually will work just fine. Interestingly enough, on this particular one, it did not work for me. And I think this is because, this is the first time that I've used this particular paper, and this paper is just really, really fibrous and not really a great watercolor paper. So sometimes you get what you pay for. I was able to kind of fix it, but that is one of the drawbacks of using a cheaper paper. You'll see also with the masking that I've masked around Norman's head and also his collar, and this will help him to kind of pop off the page a little bit, going beyond that rectangular border. I tend to use a pretty limited palette when I paint. Kind of helps to keep things kind of tied together, I think. And for this one, I use kind of my typical palette, using a Phthalo Blue, let's see, a Cobalt Turquoise, Payne's Gray, and then those are kind of on the cool side. Using a violet, which can kind of go either cool or warm. And then on the warm side, Quinacridone Rose, a Cadmium Red, an English Red, which is a little bit more opaque. And one color that I don't generally use, which is the Aureolin yellow, or sometimes called cobalt yellow, and you see that only in the background. That just kind of helps, again, just limiting the palette kind of ties all the colors together. After starting with the background, which I don't usually do, but I did in this case, I started with Norman's face by using a lighter Phthalo Blue to kind of map out the kind of some of the darker areas that are probably going to be in shadow, and I would darken it up then a little bit with some of that turquoise and occasionally some Payne's Gray. And then after having that light blue layer, you can see here now that I'm painting just a little bit of a warm, using some of the quinacridone and cadmium reds, and that will give the skin tone a lot more life. It went from being really blue and lifeless to now looking like, oh yeah, this actually looks a little bit more like skin. The traditional way of doing watercolors is to work from light to dark. So in other words, having a light layer and then adding another layer of paints on top of that, and then on top of that, and eventually it gets darker and more saturated. This is not the only way to do it. You can absolutely go other directions, starting out dark and adding light areas later. It's harder to correct things that way with watercolor, but it is one way to do it. If you happen to be new with watercolors, you might be surprised when you paint and it's wet. Your colors are really deep and saturated and dark, and then as it dries, a lot of that will go away. It'll get lighter and less saturated. This is just typical of what watercolors will do, and it's one reason we do many layers with watercolor, or you can do many layers in order to get the rich deep colors that you're looking for. You could also use the paint with less water, and it will remain a little bit more saturated and dark. Again, there's not a right or wrong way to do it. Now, using this technique with doing a lot of transparent layers, you'll see that it's going to be a constant, pushing and pulling of colors to get the right tones. And generally what I'm doing is I'm seeing, is this too blue or too cool? And the next painting layer, I'll use a little bit more warmth, some warmer colors to kind of bring that out. Or vice versa, if things are a little bit too warm, I need to cool it down a bit. That's when I'll use more of the cool colors. Now, I'm not a traditionalist or a purist when it comes to watercolors, or really with any of my art. And so you'll see that I'm finishing up this drawing with some colored pencils. I find that this allows me to really work on some of the details, maybe correct a few things that went wrong with the watercolors. And I have no problem with it. Maybe, some people do. But I think this gives it a chance to, work on the finer details and just kind of give it that extra something at the end. I hope you like Norman. I think he's kind of an interesting looking guy, and I hope you enjoyed this little walkthrough. Really appreciate you stopping by to see the creation of Norman. We hope to see you again soon.